Welcome to the NISER 201 COSIT online course on causal inference from observational studies. In the previous session, we have described the basis and history of ideas behind causal inference. In this session, we will be elaborating on Hill's viewpoints in judging causal association in a given context. We learned that the current practice of causal inference, number one, recognizes multifactorial etiology. Number two, uses probabilistic framework to test or estimate causal hypothesis or hypotheses. Third, we follow a set of viewpoints put forth by Bradford Hill in 1971 in order to examine, review or judge causality in a given context. This particular framework is currently used as a checklist for distinguishing causal from non-causal associations. We are going to elaborate on this set of viewpoints as proposed by Bradford Hill. As we know, there were these 9 viewpoints. We will now go one by one each of these viewpoints and elaborate on what do they mean and how do they make use of it in a given causal assessment. First viewpoint is on strength of association. Strong associations are less likely to be caused by bias or confounding. Any weak associations observed may be secondary to bias, confounding or residual confounding or remaining confounding due to insufficient adjustment. Stronger the association, better the belief in association. Smaller studies may capture stronger association, large studies may capture weaker association. When small studies do not capture an association, make sure you are aware of the lack of statistical power. Beware of larger studies when they capture a weaker association or a small difference. You need to be aware of the biases that could have played a role in bringing this weak or small difference. Causality controversies are rare for strong effects. Nobody has any argument around tobacco causing lung cancer in view of the stronger effects that have been reported. However, there are controversies around weaker effects. For example, passive smoking and its effects, oral contraceptives and breast cancer, hepatitis B vaccine and multiple sclerosis, DPT vaccine and its effect in terms of non-specific mortality increase. Therefore, one has to look at strength of association from these viewpoints. The second viewpoint is in terms of dose-response relationship. In a cohort study, an increase in the dose of exposure, if it leads to higher incidence of outcome, that is what dose-response relationship is. In a case-controlled study, dose-response relationship could mean increase in doses of exposure linked to a higher odds ratio. Higher the exposure, higher the odds ratio, which means there is a dose-response relationship. Documenting dose-response relationship is very vital, which means in studies, we need to collect good data on exposure. For example, if it is continuous variable, we need to collect accurately those continuous variables as they are. Blood pressure, for example, in millimeters of mercury. Categorical variables could be collected in categories. Qualitative variables could be collected with some order in it. We can then analyze any of these type of variable based on increase in the dose of exposure. We will see an example here. Exposure to injections and acute hepatitis B is an example that we are going to see for dose response. On the first row, you see no injections with reusable needle, and then the second row, single injection with reusable needle, and the third row contains multiple injections with reusable needle. As the number of injections increase, the odds ratio also increases from 4 to 10, which demonstrates there is a dose response effect. So one can believe that such dose response relationship can give us stronger belief on the association being considered. Third viewpoint is on temporality or temporal exposure outcome sequence. This is very logical in terms of its explanation. An exposure needs to precede the outcome. Very simple. But in epidemiological studies, the criteria is straight away met in cohort studies. In case control studies, if you use an appropriate reference period, then this could be met, for which you need to have an onset date, an appropriate reference exposure period. Thirdly, it is not at all met in cross-sectional studies. So therefore, one need to examine temporality with reference to the study design used in examining whether exposure preceded the outcome. We have seen 3 of the Hill's viewpoints: strength of association, dose response, temporality. These 3 can be part of a design and conduct of the study. Therefore, sometimes all these 3 can come from even a single study. Fourthly, consistency between the studies. If different studies conducted by different authors in variety of settings using different methods come to the same conclusion, or they are making this identical findings, then the causal relationship is more likely. If the findings are dependent on authors and the settings and the methods, then causality could be questioned. The fifth point is about biological plausibility. If the effect may be explained through theoretical rationale and or could be reproduced experimentally, then causality is more likely. If not, causality needs to be demonstrated. The sixth point is around specificity, more to do with infectious diseases. For example, the specificity refers to one pathogen causes one disease. It is met infrequently, for example, pneumococcus and pneumonia. However, specificity is absent in many other conditions. For example, viral hepatitis could be due to any of the viruses. It's not necessarily it is due to hepatitis G virus. We will now see the seventh point on coherence. When Hill said coherence is one of the viewpoints, he meant that cause and effect interpretation should not conflict with what is already known as natural history or biology of the disease. It's almost synonymous with biological plausibility that we saw earlier. For example, histopathologic effect of smoking on bronchial epithelium from animal studies could mean that this can happen in human beings also. It's coherence with what is already known about the effect of smoking on bronchial epithelium in a given model. The eighth point is about experimental evidence. There was no elaboration of experimental evidence, but then if the experimental evidence is available, that adds to the firming up of the examination and causal association likely to be around that exposure and outcome. Last but very important, analogy. If something happens in another context, maybe in another context this can also happen. For example, if one drug can cause birth defects, perhaps another one also. We'll see an example how Hill's guidance points could be used in a given context. We are going to see an example from Muzaffarpur in Bihar, India. In this particular setting, there were outbreaks annually happening of acute neurological illness among children aged 2 to 5 years, resulting in higher fatality since 1994. This involved acute onset of seizures, altered mental status, and it was seasonal in pattern, happened particularly during the months of May and June, which corresponded to lychee harvesting season in that particular setting, and involved mostly children 2 to 5 years. In 2014, they did a case control study. They also did number of other studies. The findings led to the confirmation of association between what they called as acute hypoglycemic encephalopathy is due to toxicity from two chemicals from lychees, and that was exacerbated by absence of eating evening meal by the children. So basically this particular study established what was not known as an association between eating lychee and the outcome of acute neurological illness in children in that setting. How do we examine this using Hill's guidance points? So here is the answer. Strength of association, is it there or not? Yes, they were talking about odds ratios higher than 4 and 7. Dose response relationship was not examined. However, temporality was examined. The children reported to have a history of not eating evening meal. Children reported to have had lychees of a higher quantity, and then they had the onset of acute encephalopathy syndrome. This is plus minus because it was based on history. It is not based on actual exposure and outcome assessment by an investigators. It was based on retrospective assessment of whether they have taken lychee or not. Consistency between the studies, yes, there was a consistency. Studies done in other settings, both in India and other parts of the world, proved that consumption of such fruit of the same family from different settings proved that it can cause acute encephalopathy syndrome. Biological plausibility, yes, it has been proven in animal studies and it's also proven in other settings. These two chemicals can induce neurological problems. Specificity, yes, this particular MCPG and hypoglycemia were shown to be very specifically causing this kind of syndrome in this setting and elsewhere. Is it coherent with already known about these chemicals and this kind of exposure? Yes, it's coherent. It is in line with what is already known from other settings. Is there an experimental evidence? There are animal models in which experiments were done to show that these chemicals can induce acute encephalopathy syndrome. Is there an evidence for analogy? Yes. The same family, there are other fruits called akki also cause similar type of illness in other settings. In India, the same family, this fruit lychee also caused similar syndrome. So analogically, the same effect were observed, fruits from the same family. There are other set of guidelines are also available apart from Hill's viewpoints. Shepard, for example, proposed a set of criteria for judging proof of teratogenicity in humans. He has proposed 7 criteria. 4 of them are essential according to him, and then rest 3 of them are helpful but not essential. This includes a proven exposure to the agent during critical stages of prenatal development, consistency of findings on more than or equal to 2 high quality epidemiological studies, which sounds similar to the consistency as proposed by Hill. Careful delineation of clinical case points to specific defect or syndrome as a result of the exposure. Rare environmental exposure that is associated with rare defect, at least more than 3 cases are needed to judge the proof of teratogenicity. Helpful but not essential, experimental evidence of teratogenicity, association that should make biological sense, and experimental proof that the agent acts in an unaltered state. It's very interesting that for examining the association between Zika virus infection and microcephaly and other brain anomalies, authors have applied both Hill's viewpoints and Shepard's criteria to examine whether we are dealing with a causal association or not. And it seems application of both Hill's viewpoints and Shepard's criteria in a given context rules more in favor of causal association than for non-causal association. Therefore, we have every reason to believe that Zika virus infections could cause microcephaly and other brain anomalies. To end with, I will like to quote Hill again, because these are very critical in understanding why we should use and in what context we should use and what do we make of the inference coming out of application of Hill's guidance points. Hill said, none of my 9 viewpoints can bring an indisputable evidence for or against the cause and effect hypothesis, and none can be required as a sine non qua. So none of them are binding rules. What they can do instead with greater or less strength is to help us in making up our minds on the fundamental question: is there any other way of explaining the set of facts before us? Is there any other answer equally or more likely than cause and effect? He also said all scientific work is incomplete, whether it be observational or experimental. Therefore, he also added all scientific work is liable to be upset or modified by advancing knowledge. That does not confer upon us a freedom to ignore the knowledge we already have or to postpone the action that it appears to demand at the given point in time. Therefore, causal inference is guided by using this kind of viewpoints. At a given point in time, we need to examine them and use the knowledge that we have at a given point in time. Summing up, Hill's guidance points can be used to distinguish causal from non-causal associations. Thank you.